moving on then, one that I wanted to put on the list as I initially proposed this one as part of the top three, but there's some reasons for it being left out, I suppose. But it's Silent Hill 2, the remake version. Having finished this year, I genuinely think that this is possibly it's definitely one of the best examples of Unreal Engine 5 to date. Not the best, but it's like up there, top three, I'd say, in terms of what they're doing with this engine. It's a real showcase for what Lumen can do specifically, because they managed to capture that atmosphere in a new way, but it feels different than most other games. There's just this feeling to walking around that town, the way that that everything is lit, like because they really just do so much with so most of the environments don't actually have electric lighting, right? It takes place in a dark kind of place that's not pleasant to be in, but you have a lot of ambient light. There's a lot of fog, obviously. Then there's darker areas, of course, where the only light source is mainly your flashlight, and just the mix of everything. It's specifically the way the GI works. There's this one part in the hospital that I think really sold it for me. When you first arrive there in this abandoned hospital, the Brookhaven Hospital, I think, it's it's lonely, it's sad. Hospitals are already kind of like depressing places for me to begin with.
Hmm.
And just seeing this old one, they so perfectly represented that like 60s, 70s looking like tile work and just design in there, right? But then it's at dusk. So there's sunlight pouring in through these like old crusted destroyed looking windows where the glass has almost become opaque from time. You've seen this kind of stuff in abandoned buildings. It's there. But the way the light comes in, bounces around the space, and just sort of like lends it this warmish orange hue as it spills into the scene, it's incredible. It just feels so beautiful and realistic in a way that I just had to like stop and just stare at this like, wow, this is outstanding. But then as you go deeper into that building, you get away from the natural light of the outside. It's there's no more windows. The fall off into darkness. This is such a difficult thing to capture, but as someone that does and has enjoyed exploring abandoned places in real life, this is one of the only games I ever played that actually captures that feeling of losing the light. The deeper you go into the building, the light gets fainter. And it felt so natural and so gradual in a way that was just like striking. So beautiful. Uh, I love the way these scenes are lit. I just think it's some of the most beautiful artistic and technical lighting I've ever seen in any video game to date. It's just a masterpiece in that regard, all the way through the end. But in addition, they also did just a phenomenal work on the materials quality, like just the cements, the stones, the metalwork, the wood, everything. Like as you would expect with a good PBR pipeline, you just get all that distinction between the different materials in a way, right? Where everything really feels like it's actually made of that material rather than just slamming together a bunch of things. Because in these sort of scenes where lighting is faint or just natural, you do run the risk of like everything kind of blending together into this like kind of incoherent, it all just looks matte kind of look. You know what I
But
mean?
easy. Yeah.
Right. But here there's still, you get that distinction between all the different material types. And there's a little bit of wetness to the world. Like you get the puddles and stuff, but it's not like soaking wet with rain necessarily. And it just, they managed to convey it. And on top of that, you also have uh, the character model quality, the cutscenes. More so than usual, they are willing to zoom the camera really far in, like really far in, where you see all the little individual whiskers. You see right up close to the eye. Like they have these moments where they rely on very subtle facial expressions, sometimes without any dialogue at all, and they're able to just zoom in and show that, and you can actually read the emotion on their face. And it's honestly just stunning. I think the performances and the model quality and the way the scenes are lit, those cutscenes are lit, it's just it's incredible. I can't say enough good things about this. So why isn't it on the top three? I think, Alex, you can kind of address this
Well, yeah.
yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, well, I also want to praise, just like John did, the lighting quality. So one thing that stood out to me when I was playing it, and I'm going to say this is probably one of the best remakes ever made.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you're going to remake a game, the way they embellished on the original here is just incredible. Like this, it stands on its own 2 feet without the first game even existing, even though it's built entirely upon it. Yeah, so I think that's great. I also want to praise like one thing I noticed is like when you get to the town the first time, and the first time you actually go into like a house, and they're kind of introducing you to like the combat mechanic in the game. All the windows in that house are actually entirely lit by outdoor skylighting from Lumen, and
Yep.
usually in games, even ones that use RTGI, like I don't know, I'll just point out Indiana Jones, which we'll talk about later, or you look at any of the games that use extensive amounts of light mapping, diffuse light mapping, such as like The Last of Us. What they'll always do by a window is they'll also point a spotlight in there by the window to fake shadows,
Yep.
essentially for the environment, because light maps are just not good enough to give you a specular response, and also not good enough to give you enough directional lighting in a scene. But here they, through probably some clever window size choices, among other things, they flaunt it. And the RTGI, as powered by Lumen, which is a specific version of RTGI, works really well. And I noticed that there wasn't any fake lights there. I can always see that. It's like, yeah, it's like, oh my God, they didn't do it. And I was so happy because I always think it looks a lot more natural. And
It does.
in this case, they also on PC, they pushed, as well as the PS5 Pro patch, which is another thing, they pushed hardware Lumen too, which is one of the few games that actually ships with it. And
right.
it made a really big difference to a lot of scenes on the PC version. It looked a lot better in a lot of ways. I think the only critique I have is something, the problem with Lumen in general is that it doesn't take into account their fog. But that's, I think, a Lumen problem and not the game's fault so much so. But in general, I thought it just was, it was on the cusp of like in the top 3 for this video until I said to John, yeah, but that performance. And I feel like it's hard to always fault everyone for the problems that Unreal Engine 5 has. But for me in a game like this where I was I play on PC, and like for me the just kind of like the Dead Space problem I had last year was where I think the game was really well done on so many levels, except my immersion was really impacted by every single frame time spike. And frame time spikes are different than low frame rates. Like I don't want to, but if you give me a 30 FPS game that is amazing, I will probably play through it. But like a judder to a frame time is like, it's like watching a movie, but then it like the movie isn't playing right. And that really impacts my immersion. And this game, unfortunately, even after patching, still has a number of them. It was worse at launch. But in this case, to me, it's just like the last thing that I wish they would have secured was some way to prevent that. Other studios are working on it. We've talked about CDPR is working at fixing a variety of sources of stutter in Unreal Engine. The people who worked on Hyenas, that not launched game, also were working on it. But they're a smaller team. Maybe they don't have a whole ton of engine and graphics programmers, which is hard to slight them for. But I really wish that was the one thing they ironed out before release, if they could have. Because for me, it was just like, it really brought down the experience. But
That's a shame. Thing is, and then so console performance is also a little bit limited. I would say right now the best way to play it is actually PS5 Pro in quality mode. With the current version of that, image quality is now really good. You get hardware Lumen, and the 30 FPS is extremely consistent. So that I think is a good way to play it. The problem is that if you play on a base PS5, you're in 30 FPS mode, you're actually still getting drops under 30. And that's where it kind of feels like, oh, you know what I mean? Where it's
Yeah.
like when you get into combat, close quarter combat with enemies, it actually dips into the 20s, and it just, it's not ruinous or anything, but it definitely takes away some of the fluidity that you would hope for, because the performance mode also just, it's a bit dodgy. It's better on Pro, I would say, but on the base PS5, it's often mostly under 60 FPS, it feels, which is not great. And image quality suffers a lot. And then on Pro, of course, in performance mode, you lose the hardware Lumen stuff. So, but I still think Silent Hill 2 is very playable, 30 FPS. And honestly, in some ways, it just feels like natural that way. I think the original was 30 FPS too, on a time when on PS2, most games during that year were targeting 60. Silent Hill 2 was one of the outliers. It just went for straight 30, but with like advanced shadows and lighting. That's the thing here. So, yeah, it's really high on the list, but in my mind, but you're right. There's just a few technical hiccups. I actually would say it still looks,
It's up there in terms of visuals.
God, it looks so good. It really looks good. I really wanted this on the top 3. Just, man, the performance issues.
It's kind of like when we talked about Callisto the 2 years before, where we were like, this would be number 1, right?
Right. If not,
and we
for,
had,
yes.
If not for the performance problems.